The frost came without mercy. It didn't negotiate. It didn't give warning beyond the shortening of days and the particular quality of light that Scandinavians learned to read the way others read text. A certain flatness to the sky, a sharpness to the shadows in late afternoon. The moment when the fjords stopped reflecting sky and started reflecting something colder and more final. When that light arrived, the people living along the coasts and through the inland valleys of what is now Norway, Sweden and Denmark had exactly one priority. Everything that could be eaten needed to be secured, stabilized and stored before the ground froze solid and the sea became impassable. There was no margin. There was no grocery store at the end of a road that stayed open, regardless of weather. There was no supply chain that would continue delivering, regardless of how deep the snow got. What you had in your possession when winter locked the land was what you had until spring. Full stop. What those people developed over centuries to solve that problem was not a collection of primitive tricks. It was a coherent, sophisticated system of food preservation that used physics, chemistry, biology, and an intimate understanding of how organic matter behaves under different environmental conditions. And they arrived at all of it through pure empirical observation, trial, catastrophic error, and the kind of hard-won knowledge that only accumulates when the alternative to getting it right is watching your family starve between January and April. The methods they perfected are, in many cases, identical to the biochemical principles that food scientists would only formally articulate 1,000 years later. That alignment is not coincidence. It is what happens when a people are sufficiently motivated by survival and given enough generations to refine their approach. The Norse world at its height, roughly between the 8th and 11th centuries, was not a world of isolated homesteads waiting passively for winter to kill them. It was a world of extraordinary practical intelligence applied to every dimension of existence, and food preservation was among the domains where that intelligence was most systematically expressed. Understanding what they did, really understanding it, not just cataloguing the techniques, but grasping why each one worked and how they fitted together into a complete seasonal strategy, reveals a civilization operating at a level of environmental mastery that commands genuine respect. Not the condescending respect given to primitive people who managed to survive despite their limitations, but the respect given to engineers who solve difficult problems elegantly with the materials at hand. Start with the most fundamental resource, salt. The Norse relationship with salt was complex and regionally variable in ways that shaped preservation strategies across different parts of Scandinavia. Coastal communities had access to sea salt through evaporation, a labor-intensive process that was never quite as productive in northern latitudes as it was in the Mediterranean, where summer heat made large-scale salt production practical. The cooler, more diffuse sunlight of Scandinavia meant that sea salt was valuable, somewhat limited, and not to be wasted. Inland communities sometimes had access to salt springs or traded aggressively for salt from coastal sources. The net result was that salt was used carefully, strategically, always in combination with other preservation methods rather than as a standalone solution. This constraint, which could easily be read as a limitation, actually drove the Norse to develop a more sophisticated multi-method approach than cultures with abundant salt ever needed to devise. Salt preservation works because it draws moisture out of food through osmosis while simultaneously creating an inhospitable environment for the bacteria responsible for decomposition. When salt concentration in the surrounding environment exceeds the salt concentration inside the cells of fish, meat or vegetables, water moves outward through the cell membranes in an attempt to equalize the concentration. The tissue dries and firms. Bacteria that require moisture to metabolize and reproduce find themselves in a physiologically hostile environment. Pathogens that rely on specific moisture levels to maintain their enzyme activity are effectively disabled. The Norse didn't know any of this mechanistically, But they knew that rubbing fish with salt and leaving it in a cool, dry space produced something that lasted months rather than days. And they knew how much salt was necessary because they had made the mistake of using too little and watched the results rot, and made the mistake of using too much and produced something so aggressively salty it was essentially inedible without extensive freshwater soaking. The empirical optimum was found the hard way. Where this connects, drop a comment letting us know what state or country you're watching from. This channel reaches people all over, and we genuinely want to know where you're tuning in from. It changes how we think about who's finding this kind of content useful. Fish was the central protein of the Norse diet along coastal regions, and the preservation of fish drove some of the most impressive technical innovation in the entire Norse food system. The two great Norse fish preservation traditions, stockfish and dried salt cod, operated on related but distinct principles, and their geographical distribution reflected the specific environmental conditions required for each. Stockfish, the older and in many ways more remarkable of the two, required no salt at all. It was developed and perfected primarily in the Lofoten Islands, off the northwestern coast of Norway, a location with an almost freakishly specific microclimate. Cold enough through the long drying season that flies could not lay eggs in the flesh, and bacteria were too inhibited to decompose it rapidly, but not so cold that the fish froze solid during the drying process. Freeze-thaw cycling, of the kind that occurs in regions with more variable temperatures, would break down the cellular structure of the fish in ways that compromised both the final texture and the preservation quality. Lofoten's climate was, by accident of geography, almost perfectly calibrated for the task. The fish, primarily cod, caught in enormous quantities during the winter spawning runs when the Atlantic cod moved into shallower waters, were beheaded, gutted, and hung in pairs over wooden racks called yell, facing outward with the tail loops creating natural hangers. They hung there for 3 months or more, exposed to the cold, dry air and the coastal winds that accelerated evaporation while preventing the accumulation of moisture that would allow mold to establish itself. During this time, they lost somewhere between 70% and 80% of their original weight. What remained was a product so thoroughly desiccated that its moisture content had dropped below the threshold at which any microbial activity could proceed. The fish had been converted into a stable, shelf-stable material that could be stored for years, not months, years. Its protein content per unit weight, once the water was removed, was remarkable. Travelers and traders recognized that a small quantity of stockfish, rehydrated and cooked, could sustain a person far more effectively than an equivalent weight of fresh food. This caloric density relative to weight and volume made stockfish arguably the most important portable food technology in the medieval North Atlantic world. The Norse used it to provision longships for extended ocean voyages. It fed the crews that crossed the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the shores of North America. Without the stockfish tradition, the geography of Norse expansion looks fundamentally different. The biochemistry of what happens during the stockfish drying process is genuinely interesting even from a purely scientific standpoint. As the moisture leaves the flesh, the protein structures within the muscle tissue undergo changes, not the denaturation caused by heat, but a slower process of molecular rearrangement driven by desiccation. The resulting protein matrix is extremely stable. When stockfish is rehydrated, a process that takes days of soaking in fresh water, with the water changed repeatedly, the fish does not return to exactly its original fresh state, but it returns to something nutritionally complete and texturally usable. Norse households would have soaked stockfish as a matter of routine, working the rehydration process into the rhythm of meal planning, the way modern households plan ahead for frozen items that need to thaw. The salted fish tradition, which reached its highest development with what would eventually become the internationally traded dried salt cod, combined the moisture-reducing effects of both salt and air drying in sequence. The fish was first salted, rubbed with or immersed in brine to draw out internal moisture and begin the preservation process, and then dried, typically on flat rocks along the shoreline or on wooden frames. The salt created an initial hostile environment for spoilage organisms and began the dehydration process. The subsequent drying removed additional moisture and further concentrated the salt in the remaining tissue. The double action produced a product that was both more resistant to spoilage than unsalted dried fish and more forgiving of the slightly less optimal drying conditions found in regions without Lofoten's specific microclimate. The salted approach spread the fish preservation technology to more of Scandinavia, and eventually, as Norse traders moved into Atlantic Europe, to the broader maritime world. Meat preservation followed related principles, but with complications arising from the different structural and chemical properties of animal tissue compared to fish. The lower fat content of most fish relative to land animals was actually an advantage in preservation. Fat oxidizes, producing rancidity in ways that bacteria-driven spoilage in lean tissue does not. And managing fat oxidation added a layer of complexity to the preservation of pork, beef, mutton, and horse meat that the fish tradition didn't have to contend with. The Norse solution to this was, characteristically, to address the different components of the problem separately and combine the solutions. The autumn slaughter, the blot in its non-religious dimension, the practical seasonal necessity that gave certain autumn festivals their character, was timed precisely to the moment when animals had reached maximum weight from summer grazing, but before the harsh winter would begin burning that weight off in thermoregulation. Killing animals at this moment maximized the food yield per animal, and also meant that the cold temperatures immediately following were a natural ally. In the weeks following the slaughter, ambient temperatures in much of Scandinavia were low enough that meat could be handled and processed without rapid spoilage, while preserving procedures were underway. Lean cuts and muscle meat were salted and dried or smoked, using methods that parallel the fish preservation approach. Moisture reduction, salt creating an inhospitable environment for spoilage bacteria, smoke adding an additional layer of chemical preservation through the antimicrobial and antioxidant compounds in wood smoke. Fatty cuts and organ meat presented different challenges and received different treatment. Lard, rendered pork fat, was a preservation medium in itself. Meat submerged in rendered fat was sealed away from oxygen, preventing the oxidative reactions that produce rancidity in the fat itself and the aerobic bacterial activity that breaks down the proteins. This technique, called confit in later French culinary tradition but practiced in various forms across Northern Europe, was particularly valuable for preserving the liver, heart, and other organ meats that were nutritionally dense but especially perishable. If you've made it this far in the video, we'd love to hear what brought you here. Are you into history, into food science, into survivalist topics, or did this just find you on a random evening? Drop it in the comments. We read them. Smoking deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of historical food preservation, which tend to treat it as a vague, generic technique rather than the precisely developed craft it actually was. The Norse smoking tradition was not a matter of hanging meat near a fire and hoping for the best. It was a controlled process with understood variables: wood species, temperature, duration, moisture level of the food being smoked, and the management of the airflow that determined whether the smoke produced the desired preservation effect or simply coated the outside of the food in a layer that might look preserved while the interior continued to deteriorate. Different wood species produce chemically distinct smoke profiles. alder, which was widely available in Scandinavia and became the traditional wood for smoking fish in Norwegian tradition, produces smoke relatively rich in phenolic compounds, chemicals that have both antimicrobial properties and antioxidant effects. The phenols deposit on the surface of the food and penetrate into the outer layers, creating a chemical barrier against both bacterial action and fat oxidation. Birch, another ubiquitous Scandinavian wood, produces a sweeter smoke profile with different chemical characteristics that made it preferred for certain meat applications. Juniper, with its distinctive resinous aromatics, was used for specific applications where its particular smoke chemistry, higher in terpene compounds, was considered preferable. The Norse developed these preferences empirically, noticing that food smoked with different woods lasted differently and tasted differently, and the practical selection of wood for smoking purposes encoded a real, if unarticulated, understanding of wood smoke chemistry. The smoking structures used ranged from purpose-built smokehouses, structures designed to concentrate smoke around hanging food while controlling airflow and temperature, to the integrated smoke environment of the longhouse itself, where the central fire without a chimney allowed smoke to rise slowly through the living space and accumulate in the upper reaches of the building before escaping through roof vents. Meat hung from the rafters of a Norse longhouse was continuously slow-smoked throughout the winter, receiving ongoing preservation treatment as a byproduct of the heating and cooking fires below. This passive, continuous smoking was not as intense as active smokehouse treatment, but it contributed meaningfully to the preservation of meat stored in this way, and the flavor profiles it produced became central to Norse culinary identity. The particular taste of food that had lived in a smoke-filled environment for months is distinctive and was almost certainly experienced as desirable rather than merely acceptable. Cold storage was the third major pillar of the Norse preservation system, and here the climate that made everything so difficult was simultaneously pressed into service as a tool. Below-ground food storage, the root cellar in various configurations, exploited the thermal mass of the earth to maintain temperatures in a range that dramatically slowed bacterial metabolism without freezing the food solid. The physics involved is straightforward, but the practical construction and management of effective underground storage required considerable knowledge and attention. Temperature, humidity, and airflow in an underground storage space all interact in ways that can either extend the storage life of produce dramatically or destroy it completely, and getting those variables right required the same kind of multi-generational empirical knowledge that informed every other aspect of the Norse preservation tradition. Root vegetables, turnips which were cultivated, and various wild roots gathered from forests and meadows were among the primary candidates for cold storage. Their cell structure and relatively low water content made them more tolerant of the fluctuating humidity conditions of an underground space than more delicate plant materials. Cabbages and their relatives could be stored whole in cold conditions for months. Apples and other fruits, where available, could be kept in cold storage substantially longer than at room temperature. The key management challenge was preventing the freezing that would rupture cell walls and cause rapid deterioration upon thawing, while maintaining temperatures cold enough to suppress biological activity. A well-designed and well-situated underground storage space in Scandinavia could hold a surprisingly wide range of plant foods from harvest through the deepest months of winter, supplementing the preserved animal proteins that constituted the majority of the winter diet. The fermentation tradition occupies a category that is in some ways the most intellectually interesting of all Norse preservation approaches, because it inverts the usual logic of preservation. Rather than creating conditions hostile to all biological activity, fermentation deliberately harnesses specific microbial activity, lactic acid bacteria, in most traditional fermentation applications, to transform the chemical environment of a food in ways that prevent the growth of dangerous pathogenic bacteria. The lactic acid produced by these bacteria lowers the pH of the food to a level at which pathogens cannot survive. The result is a food that has been transformed by microbial action, but is now stable and safe precisely because of that transformation rather than despite it. This is getting deep, and if you're watching on a weekend morning with coffee, this is exactly the kind of video designed for that. Tell us below, what time is it where you are right now, and what are you doing while you watch? We're genuinely curious about those kinds of details. The Norse fermentation tradition produced several distinct products, of which the most famous, and probably the most misunderstood, is rakfisk, fermented trout or char. The fish, usually caught in autumn, was packed into wooden barrels or stone containers with salt and left to ferment for a period ranging from several months to a year or more at cool temperatures. The fermentation process involved the action of naturally occurring bacteria in and on the fish, acting on the proteins and fats, producing lactic acid and a range of complex flavor compounds as metabolic byproducts. The result is pungent, extraordinarily so by standards calibrated to fresh food, but chemically stable and safe to eat in a way that superficially similar products that have simply spoiled are not. The distinction between controlled fermentation and uncontrolled spoilage is the presence of the lactic acid bacteria dominating the microbial environment. Their acid production prevents the establishment of pathogenic bacteria, creating a preserved food rather than a rotted one. Getting the salt concentration right was critical. Too little salt and the wrong bacteria established themselves, producing something genuinely dangerous rather than preserved. Too much salt, and the fermentation was inhibited entirely. The specific salt concentration that allowed lactic acid fermentation to dominate while suppressing pathogens was discovered through exactly the kind of trial and catastrophic error that characterized Norse food knowledge development generally. Soured dairy products represent another dimension of the Norse fermentation tradition. In a world without refrigeration, fresh milk was a perishable commodity that became inedible within hours during warmer months and within a day or two even in cool conditions. The Norse understood, again without formal microbial knowledge but with complete empirical certainty, that certain transformation processes applied to milk produced products that lasted dramatically longer than the fresh material. Skyr, the Icelandic cultured dairy product that has experienced an international revival in recent years, is a direct descendant of the Norse fermented dairy tradition. Milk inoculated with bacterial cultures that convert lactose to lactic acid, producing a thickened, acidified product with a dramatically extended shelf life relative to fresh milk. Butter, which separates the fat from the aqueous components of milk and removes most of the lactose that bacteria require as a food source, was another Norse dairy preservation strategy. Salted butter could be stored for extended periods, and there is archaeological evidence from Ireland and Scotland, regions with significant Norse settlement, of butter buried in bogs for long-term storage, where the anaerobic, acidic, cold, bog environment provided additional preservation conditions beyond the salt and fat content of the butter itself. The broader dairy preservation strategy also included hard cheeses, pressed, salted and aged, in which the combination of low moisture content, salt, and the changed chemical environment produced by the cheese-making process created a product stable enough for months-long winter storage. Norse dairy production was constrained by the practical reality that animals produce much less milk in winter than in summer, creating a seasonal pattern in which summer abundance was converted into preserved forms, skyr, butter, cheese, that could sustain the household through the months when the animals produced little or nothing. The entire dairy preservation system was essentially a technology for redistributing summer's microbial and caloric resources across the time dimension of winter scarcity. Fermented beverages, primarily various forms of ale brewed from grain and flavored with mixtures of herbs, collectively known as gruit before hops became standard, occupied a place in the Norse nutrition strategy that extended beyond pure pleasure or ritual significance. The brewing process, which involves allowing grain to germinate partially before kilning it, then fermenting the resulting sugars with yeast, produces a beverage in which the combination of alcohol, low pH, and carbon dioxide creates a hostile environment for many pathogenic bacteria. In an era before widespread water purification, a lightly alcoholic beverage might actually be safer to drink than untreated water from sources shared with animals. This is not to say that Norse people drank nothing but ale, but it does suggest that the fermented beverage tradition contributed to community health in ways that went beyond nutrition, a point often overlooked in accounts that focus exclusively on preservation of solid foods. Grain itself presented a preservation challenge of a different character, not the rapid biological decomposition that threatened meat and fish, but the slower processes of mold growth, insect infestation, and moisture absorption that could destroy a grain store over months if it was improperly managed. The Norse solution was cold, dry storage with careful management of the grain's moisture content. Grain, dried to low moisture levels before storage, resisted mold, which requires moisture to establish and grow, and could be stored through winter without significant loss if kept dry and cool. The construction of storage facilities that maintained low humidity while protecting grain from the moisture of snow, rain, and condensation was a practical engineering problem with substantial consequences for community survival. A grain store lost to mold in January was a crisis with no easy solution. Norse storage architecture reflected this understanding: elevated granaries that allowed air circulation beneath the floor to prevent ground moisture migration, tight construction to exclude vermin, and siting away from the persistent moisture sources that characterized low-lying areas. This is a good moment to pause. Not the video, don't pause, but tell us something in the comments. If you had to preserve food for an entire winter using only what nature provides in your region, where would you even start? No refrigerators, no plastic, no supermarkets. What does your local landscape actually give you to work with? Genuine question. We want to see what people come up with. Wild foods gathered from forest, field, and coast constituted a significant supplement to the cultivated and domesticated food supply, and their preservation was integrated into the same overall seasonal strategy. Berries, lingonberries, cloudberries, blueberries, crowberries in the far north were gathered in enormous quantities during their brief seasonal windows, and preserved primarily through two mechanisms. The high natural sugar content of many berries allowed them to be preserved in concentrated form through reduction, creating preserves that resisted spoilage through osmotic pressure, analogous to the mechanism of salt preservation. And the freezing temperatures of winter allowed berries packed into containers and stored in unheated spaces to simply remain frozen until needed. The cloudberry in particular contains high levels of benzoic acid, a natural antimicrobial compound that contributed to its remarkable shelf stability even without additional processing. The Norse recognition that cloudberries kept better than other berries without special treatment encoded a true observation about their chemical composition that would be formally explained only in the modern era. Hazelnuts, walnuts were available in southern Scandinavia, and various wild seeds provided concentrated caloric density that could be stored dry for extended periods. Archaeological excavations of Norse settlement sites consistently produce evidence of stored nuts and seeds in quantities suggesting systematic harvesting and storage rather than casual foraging. The caloric math was understood implicitly. Nuts and seeds deliver more energy per unit volume than most other plant foods. They store without processing, and they provide fats that are difficult to obtain during winter when animal slaughter has been completed and dairy production is minimal. The foraging component of the Norse food system was not a marginal supplement to agriculture, but a substantial element of the total food strategy. And the preservation of foraged materials was as carefully managed as the preservation of cultivated and domesticated foods. The organizational dimension of Norse food preservation is worth examining as carefully as the technical dimension, because the technical methods only worked within a social structure capable of coordinating and executing them at the required scale and within the required time windows. Preservation was fundamentally a community activity. The autumn slaughter, the fish drying, the smoking, the fermentation, all of these activities required labor that exceeded what a single household could readily supply in the compressed time windows that seasonal conditions allowed. The Norse household unit was typically larger than the modern nuclear family, incorporating extended family members, servants, and sometimes unfree workers whose labor was directed in part toward collective food preparation. The social events that clustered around preservation activities, the gatherings that combined practical work with the social reinforcement of community bonds, were not mere additions to the preservation work. They were integral to making the scale of work achievable. The knowledge transmission within this system was primarily oral and practical rather than written. A Norse child growing up in this world learned preservation techniques not from texts, but from direct participation under adult supervision, beginning with age-appropriate tasks and progressing through the full sequence of techniques over years of involvement. The technical knowledge was embedded in practice, in the hands and in the sensory experience of the person doing the work, how the fish should feel when it has dried adequately, what the brine should taste like, what color the smoke should be, what smell indicates a fermentation is proceeding correctly versus going wrong. This embodied knowledge was more resistant to disruption than written knowledge in some ways. It could not be lost in a fire or a flood, but it was also more vulnerable to population loss. Communities devastated by disease or warfare sometimes lost preservation knowledge along with the people who carried it, and the recovery of that knowledge required rebuilding the experiential base from scratch. The geography of Norse settlement shaped preservation traditions in ways that created significant regional variation. Communities in the Norwegian fjord regions had access to abundant fish and developed the stockfish and dried fish traditions to extraordinary levels of refinement. Communities in the more agricultural regions of Denmark and southern Sweden had greater access to grain and root vegetables and developed storage and fermentation traditions centered on plant foods. Communities in Iceland, settled from Norway in the 9th century, arrived in an environment without trees suitable for construction or fuel and without the agricultural tradition of the Scandinavian mainland fully established, and were forced to adapt their preservation techniques to local conditions. Volcanic geothermal heat replacing fire for some cooking applications, abundant seabird eggs and marine mammals supplementing the fish and sheep that formed the core of the Icelandic food base. The Norse preservation tradition was not a single monolithic system, but a family of related approaches adapted to locally available resources with the underlying principles consistent across variations. The intersection of preservation technology and Norse expansion is one of the more consequential dynamics in medieval history, and one that receives too little attention in standard accounts. The longship is rightly celebrated as a technological achievement that enabled the Norse to operate across ocean distances that were beyond the reach of any other culture of the period. But the longship without adequate preserve provisions was limited to coastal raiding and short hops between friendly ports. The ability to carry stockfish and other preserved foods in quantities sufficient to sustain a crew for weeks or months was what transformed the longship from a coastal vessel into an ocean-crossing machine. The food technology enabled the navigation technology to realize its full potential. The settlement of Iceland in 870, Greenland around 985, and the brief establishment of a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland around 1000 were all dependent on the ability to carry enough preserved food for the voyage and to provision the settlement period before local food production could be established. The Norse preserved food tradition was, in a meaningful sense, one of the enabling technologies of the age of exploration, a point that tends to be overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements of the story. Last thing before we wrap, this video took real research to put together, and if you found it worthwhile, the most useful thing you can do is share it with someone who would enjoy it. Not subscribe, not like, just forward it to one person. A friend, a family member, someone who would spend an evening watching this and find it interesting. That kind of sharing is what actually helps this channel grow. The legacy of Norse food preservation techniques in the modern world is more substantial than most people realize. Stockfish remained a major international trade commodity through the entire medieval period and well into the modern era, forming the economic foundation of the Norwegian fishing industry for centuries, and feeding populations across southern Europe, West Africa, and the Caribbean, where salt cod in particular became a staple of enormous cultural significance. Skyer, having been produced continuously in Iceland since the Norse settlement of the island, has in the past 2 decades become an internationally marketed product, appearing in grocery stores across North America and Europe, a direct cultural transmission from the Norse fermentation tradition across more than 1,000 years. Rakfisk, lutefisk, the lye-treated dried cod that represents a further development of the stockfish tradition, and various forms of fermented dairy products remain living elements of Scandinavian culinary culture, consumed not merely as nostalgic artifacts, but as genuine parts of everyday food life. The techniques that kept Norse families alive through 11th century winters are still producing food in the 21st century. The continuity of a practical tradition from one of the most demanding environments in human history to the contemporary global food landscape is, when you sit with it, a remarkable thing. Not remarkable in a vague, general way, but specifically remarkable because it means that the empirical knowledge accumulated by people who had no choice but to get it right, because the alternative was starvation, was sufficiently well calibrated to remain useful across a millennium of dramatic change in almost every other dimension of human life. The science that would eventually explain why their methods worked arrived thousands of years after the methods themselves. The methods didn't wait for the science. They worked because the people who developed them paid close enough attention to the consequences of what they did to distinguish, reliably and repeatedly, between what worked and what didn't. That quality of attention, applied to the specific problem of keeping food safe and nutritious through a northern winter, is what Norse food preservation ultimately represents. And it is, by any reasonable measure, an intellectual achievement worthy of the attention we have spent on it.